We are on DAF Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, and we were in the middle of a discussion. We're discussing a machlokus, a very important machlokus between Rabbi and Rav Chisda, as to whether we apply the principle of Ho'il. Does the principle of Ho'il exist at all? Ho'il is in theory ... In other words, does the halachic status change if in theory it could be another way? Do we give it that in the theoretical status right now? As far as Yontif is concerned, Rabbi says we apply the principle of Ho'il such that if a person were to cook on Yontif for Chol, even though that's his intention, he's still not doing an Isser D'Oraisa, because since in theory guests could arrive, the cooking turns out that it's not for Chol, but rather for the Yontif itself, and therefore he's not in violation. Rav Chisda disagrees. Rav Chisda says you don't apply the principle of Ho'il, and therefore if a person is clearly cooking for Yontif, from Yontif for Shabbos, so then he's doing an Isser D'Oraisa, he gets Malkus for that. What's more, Rav Chisda, when he was presented with the challenge of what are you going to do with the fact that at least D'Oraisa, it seems that it's permitted to cook on Yontif for Shabbos, such that the only thing that's left is an Isser D'Rabbanan, and that's what the year of Tavshilin is for. According to you, Rav Chisda, if you're not allowed to cook on Yontif for any other day other than Yontif, what right do you have to cook on Yontif for Shabbos? Why is there no Isser D'Oraisa there if you don't apply the principle of Ho'il? Answers Rav Chisda, it's because I hold that D'Oraisa, the only Isser is cooking on Yontif for Chol. But cooking on Yontif for Shabbos was never under the prohibition of Malacha on Yontif. When the Torah gives you a dispensation to cook for Ochel Nefesh, to do Malacha for Ochel Nefesh, for food on Yontif, it's permitting you to both cook for Yontif and for Shabbos, because they're both subsumed under the idea of a holy day. You're on Yontif, you're allowed to cook for a holy day. And that brought us to our next question. Our next question was, well, if that's the case, Rav Chisda, then why is it that when Friday coincides with Yontif, you're not allowed to bake the Lechem Hapanim, where the purpose of the consumption of the Lechem Hapanim is to be consumed the following Shabbos, which is 9 days later. There, you're baking the bread on Yontif for Shabbos, so why is that problematic? Why does the Brisa say that you're not allowed to bake the showbread on Yontif? You have to bake it the day before. That was the question, and Rav Chisda answered very simply, because when the Torah says that you're allowed to cook from Yontif to Shabbos, it's only when Shabbos is immediately adjacent to Yontif. But if you're cooking on Yontif for 9 days later, that's not something that falls under the Torah's dispensation of cooking for Yontif for Shabbos.
9 days.
The Lechem Hapanim is eaten 9 days later.
When is it usually baked?
It's always baked on Friday, unless Friday is Yontif, in which you have to do it the day before. That's what we learned yesterday. That was the Gemara that we saw yesterday. So the question was, according to you, Rav Chisda, that you're allowed to bake on Yontif for Shabbos. What's wrong with baking when Yontif falls out on Friday? So bake it on Friday. What's the big deal? The purpose of it is to be able for it to be consumed on Shabbos. It's not the immediately adjacent Shabbos, but it's the following Shabbos. So what's the problem? Rav Chisda says no. The Torah's dispensation is only when Yontif and Shabbos are contiguous, when they're adjacent to each other. But when they're spaced out a week apart, there the Torah doesn't give you the heter of cooking on Yontif for Shabbos.
So what is Rav Chisda coming to a solution? If he said no, but we have to eat it 9 days later.
So no. So then in that case it's 10 days. So then you bake it the day before Yontif, and when Rosh Hashanah is 2 days, you bake it on Wednesday. That's what we saw yesterday in the Brisa. So now the Gemara asks, okay, that works all according to the Chachamim, who were the authors of that Brisa about the Lechem Hapanim that we just saw. However, he says, and Ula Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Do Amar Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Asgan, Doches Yontav ve'inu Doches Yom Tzom, Mai Ika L'meimar. But wait a minute. There's another Tana who says that you are allowed to bake the Lechem Hapanim on Yontif, even though you're not going to be able to benefit from that bread until the following Shabbos 9 days later. So how do you understand the halacha according to that Tana? The only time that you're not allowed to bake the showbread when it falls out on a Friday is when Friday coincides with Yom Kippur. because there's no dispensation of ochel nefesh. But on any other yontif, you are allowed to bake the lechem haponim. So what are you going to say according to him? So Baha Pligi. So Rav Chisda will tell you, well, that's exactly the machlokis. Mar sover shvus karova hitiru shvus rechoka lo hitiru. Umar sover shvus rechoka nami hitiru. The machlokis is very simply that when we allow you to cook on yontif for Shabbos, is it only the adjacent Shabbos that we allow you to cook on yontif for? That's the opinion of the Chachamim, and the opinion of Rishon ben Gamliel is we permit you even to cook on Yantif when Shabbos is non-contiguous, non-adjacent.
Because of the Ho'il.
No, not because of Ho'il. No. Reb Chisda doesn't hold of Ho'il. Rabbi holds of Ho'il. Reb Chisda says that it's mutter to do ochel nefesh on Yantif for Shabbos. Remember, you got to split those two apart. He who holds Ho'il does not hold of Reb Chisda. Does not hold of this halacha of Reb Chisda that ochel nefesh is permitted on Yantif for both Yantif and Shabbos. Okay? All right. So Massiv Rav Mari. So Rav Mari now challenges Reb Chisda even further. So we see now a similar brisa, and here we're not going to be talking about the lechem hapanim. We're going to be talking about a similar concept called the shtei halechem. Now the shtei halechem are the two loaves of bread that are baked to be used in the sacrificial service on Shavuos. You bake two loaves of bread, of wheat bread, you wave them over the Mizbeach, and then afterwards they are eaten. So shtei halechem einon ne'echalos lo pachos mishnaim v'lo yoser al shlosha. So just like we said previously in yesterday's brisa, that you can bake the lechem hapanim anywhere from 9 days to 11 days before they're going to be eaten, so too, when we talk about the shtei halechem, you bake them anywhere from 2 days to 3 days before they're going to be eaten. Keitzad nefos erev Yom Tov. So how does it work? When erev Yom Tov of Shavuos is a regular day, so then you bake them on erev Yom Tov. So then when is the bread eaten? The following day. That's the second day. Okay. Nechalos li Yom Tov l'shnayim. Okay. But chal Yom Tov lios achar haShabbos. But if Shavuos falls out on a Sunday, in which case you're not allowed to bake the lechem hapanim on erev Yantiv, because erev Yantiv is Shabbos, ne'achalos li Yom Tov l'shlosha. Then you have to bake them on Friday, and therefore you can only eat the lechem hapanim on the third day. Okay, fine. Lefi she'ein adocha lo asa Shabbos v'lo asa Yom Tov. And the reason is because the baking of the lechem hapanim does not override neither Shabbos nor Yom Tov. So you can't bake the lechem hapanim on Shavuos itself, you have to bake it before Shavuos. So, my question is as follows to you, Rav Chisda. V'yomar tzorchei Shabbos nasin b'yom tov, hashta the Shabbos b'yom tov, shari the yom tov b'yom tov mibaya, question mark? The question is as follows. It's a little bit of you have to think a little bit more abstractly in order to understand the question. The question on Rav Chisda is like this. You, Rav Chisda, say that you're allowed to cook on Yontif for the sake of a holy day that is not today. Then surely it should be permitted to bake on Yontif for later on in the very same day of Yontif. Mm-hmm. Now I understand that there's a problem here because we shouldn't, one argument would be, perhaps we shouldn't allow you to bake bread on Yontif unless you can eat it immediately after you bake it. And here you cannot eat it immediately after you bake it because this lechem hapanim is usher until it is waved over the mizbeach together with the sacrificial meats. And therefore, until you bring the karbanos of Shavuos, the animal sacrifices of Shavuos, this bread is not kosher for consumption. And therefore, you could argue theoretically that we're not allowed to bake the bread on Yontif if you can't eat it immediately after baking. But you, Rav Chisda, apparently hold not that way, because not only do you permit us to bake on Yontif for later on the very same day, you even allow us to bake on Yontif for tomorrow, which is Shabbos. So surely it should be permitted in this situation to be able to bake on Yontif, to have it later in the day on Yontif after the karbanos are brought. So the question therefore is only according to you, Rav Chisda. Why is it that it's not permitted to bake the shtei halechem on Shavuos itself? So the Gemara answers, Shaini hasam da'amar kra lachem, lachem v'lo legavoa. So the Gemara says it's different. The Torah says that you're only allowed to cook and to bake on Yontif. It may be done for you. cooking is only for you, but if you're cooking primarily for God, because this bread is going to be used for sacrificial purposes, so then the Torah never gives you a dispensation to bake on Yontif. Now, we might argue that would be this. You can now apply this answer to our discussion previously for the lechem hapanim. Since it's true, although it's true that the Kohanim are going to consume the lechem hapanim, but primarily it's used for sacrificial purposes in the Beis Hamikdash. Once I have this answer, it would also explain the question that we asked on Reb Chisda previously from the lechem hapanim. You know why you're not allowed to bake on Friday when Friday coincides with Yontif? Because it's only lachem. It's only when the bread is primarily for you. I believe that that's what you can read in the Gemara, and that's on that basis the Gemara now asks the next question. Well, Reb Shimon Gamliel da'amar mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Hasagan doche es Yom Tov ma'ika l'meimar. But according to Reb Shimon Gamliel of the previous brisa, who says that you are allowed to bake the lechem hapanim on Friday that coincides with Yontif, what are you going to say? What about this pasuk of lachem v'lo legavoa, that you can only do ochel nefesh malacha for yourselves and not for Hashem? Answers the Gemara, Savar la ka'abashol da'amar lachem lachem v'lo l'nachrim. He says that word lachem in the pasuk does not exclude the permissibility to cook for Hashem, but rather excludes the permissibility to cook for non-Jews. Which means that the halacha is that while you're allowed to cook food for yourself on Yontif, you cannot cook food for a non-Jew on Yontif, which, by the way, has very practical halachic applications, such that, for example, you're not allowed to invite a non-Jew for a meal on Yontif. Right. Not because he can't have a Seder with you, not because there's something holy and sanctified about the day and you can't include a non-Jew in the sanctity of the day. That's a myth. That's a total myth. The reason why there's a problem of inviting a non-Jew over for a meal on Yontif is because Shema Yarbe Bishvilu, you may end up cooking more food for him on Yontif. That's the reason why it's usur, because you're not allowed to cook on Yontif for a non-Jew.
So living is a problem.
What?
A living goy that stays with you.
It could very much be a problem of Shema Yarbe Bishvilo. Absolutely it's going to be a problem. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch deals with it. You have to let the... What? If you have a live-in caregiver, absolutely it could be potentially a problem. So you have to go through the sugya, okay?
But doesn't this answer create a problem then for the shtei lechem? A different answer for lechem for shtei lechem.
What do you mean?
Well, when we did this answer about cooking for a goy, that he's using lechem to cook for goys for the lechem aponim.
Yeah, but the same thing would... Oh, so your question is, then according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, so maybe according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, it would be permitted to bake the shtei halechem on Yontif. We don't know. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel only is cited in the discussion of the lechem hapanim. We don't know what he's going to hold by the shtei halechem. It's a very good point. Yeah.
This idea sort of came up about that you have to eat it right. Yeah, if you're going to cook it, bake it on Yontif, you should eat it right away. Where did that come from? We never talked about it. We never said. We always said, it's for the day, but suddenly now it's introducing a new idea as though we already knew about it. Correct. You're right. There's sometimes certain gaps in the logic that the Gemara takes as a given. But the Gemara is assuming that the only time that you're allowed to cook for Yontif is if it's immediately available to you. If you're going to have to delay for a significant amount of time because you have to do other things beforehand, maybe there would be an argument to say you wouldn't be allowed to. Anyway, Shalach le Rav Chisda le Rabba bar biyad Rav Acha bar Ravuna. So now that we finished our questioning of Rav Chisda, now we're going to go the opposite direction. Now Rav Chisda is going to challenge Rabba. Now remember, what does Rabba hold? What's that word? Hoil. Good. So you hold of Hoil, that there's no Isser Deoraisa when you're cooking from Yontif to Chol because of Hoil, because of, in theory, guests could always come. So now Rav Chisda sends a challenge to Rabba via his proxy Rav Acha. Mi amrinan Hoil. Since when do we say Hoil? V'hatnan. Look at the following Mishnah. Yesh choresh tlem echad v'chayovin aleha mishum shmona lavin. In theory, it is possible to plow one furrow of earth and incur in that one act 8 different mitzvahs lo saseh. You get malchus 8 times for that act. How is that possible? Hachoresh b'shor v'chamor. So number 1, you're plowing with a forbidden mixture of animals because you plow under one yoke an ox and a donkey. Okay? That's number 1. 2 and 3 is vehein mukdashim.
that both the ox and the donkey are sanctified for God, but they're different because the ox is sanctified as a korban, he's a bull, he's sanctified as a korban. The donkey is not sanctified as a korban, he's sanctified for bedek habayis. So those are two separate biblical prohibitions, to use both kedushay mizbeach and kedushay bedek kodshay bedek habayis. So that's 2 and 3. The kilayim bekerim, and then while you're plowing, you move the seeds to the point where you cause the wheat and the vine, the grape seed to intermix. Please, someone open up Benny's Gemara. So that's number 4. Number 5, ushavias. You're plowing on Yontif. On Shemitah. So that's number 5. That's infraction number 5. And b'Yom Tov, you're plowing on Yom Tov, so you're doing a malacha on Yom Tov. That's number 6. And Kohen v'Nazer abei satuma. And furthermore, you're plowing in a cemetery, and you're a Kohen and a Nazir. So you really hit the jackpot with this one. So you've got number 7 and number 8 now.
This was the original punishment.
That's right. The Amrinan. So now that's the end of the Mishnah. My question to you, Rabbi, is as follows: The Amrinan Hoil. If you apply the principle of Hoil, acharei shelo lichayiv Hoil v'chazi l'kisoy dam tzipor. If you hold of the principle of Hoil in theory, we should apply the halachic status of something that could be in potentio. So then my question to you is as follows. Potentially, digging up earth on Yontif is not a malacha in the event that I need to cover up the blood of a bird that I've just slaughtered. Now, it's a very difficult premise, and we don't have time to go through the entire sugya. This is really a sugya which requires tremendous tremendous in-depth analysis. Tosfos is very perplexed by this whole premise because you're not allowed to do kisoi hadam by digging up earth. In other words, halachically you're obligated to have the earth prepared from before Yantiv. It's a whole sugya in Maseches BAYT. So Tosfos says the premise of the Gemara is that halachically, if you've slaughtered a chicken and you neglected to prepare earth from before, then we apply the principle of aseh doichelos aseh, that a positive obligation of kisei hadam overrides the mitzvahs los aseh of thou shalt not plow, and therefore you're allowed to dig up the earth in order to do kisei hadam. Therefore, there's a permitted scenario of plowing earth on Yantif. So therefore, the Gemara says, in theory, if there was blood here, it would be permitted for you to dig up the earth. So then why don't I apply that principle of Hoil, in theory, to obviate the Isser Deoraisa of Malacha on Yantif? So this is a challenge for you, Rabbi. If you truly hold of the principle of Hoil, then there should be no Isser Deoraisa of plowing on Yantif.
He came up with like 8 different components to this.
No, that's the Mishnah. But the challenge is based on one of the 8.
Oh.
The challenge is based on one of the 8. One of the 8, according to you, Rabbi, should not hold. Yeah. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa bar Shmuel ba'avana mikur zalos. We're talking about rocks where you're dealing with not really earth. You're dealing with avanim mikur zalos, which means that you can't use these rocks where the vines are growing. You can't really use them for kisei hadam because the earth for kisei hadam has to be granular. And this is not granulated. This is in solid clumps. So the Gemara now says, but re'uyos l'kosishan. But you could always break up these large clumps, and then it would be okay. So the Gemara says, u'chasisha b'yom tov mishari. But that in itself is going to be a forbidden act, and since it's not directly related to the mitzvah of kisei adam, then we wouldn't be able to even apply aseh dochelos aseh, and it would be a malacha unto itself. The Gemara answers, no, re'uyos l'kosishan kila achar yad, but you could break up the clumps in a non-direct fashion, in the non-normative fashion, and therefore you wouldn't be doing a malacha. So why don't you say that? So the Gemara answers bitsunima. We're talking about solid rock, which is where you're doing the plowing, and there by solid rock, even to break up the clumps, there's nothing that you can do. So the Gemara says tsunima bar zuriya. Since when can you plant on solid rock? The Gemara answers tsunima milamala va'afar tichoach milamata. The answer is that there's a thin layer of solid rock, and underneath it is earth And that's why you're able to plow, because you're able to get to, somehow you're able to get to beneath the surface of the rock. So the Gemara says, so then you have earth accessible to you. So what's the big deal then? Then you're not doing any Isser. Because if you have earth beneath there, so then you should apply the hoel to the earth, and therefore your act of plowing should not be an Isser d'oraisa. Ela Omer Mar Baravashi Betina. We're talking about mud. It's mud, and because mud is not granular, because it's mud, it's like you slosh in mud, so that's why there's no possibility of kisei hadam, and that's why you can't apply hoel. So the Gemara says, Vitina bar zeriyahi, who? Since when can you plant in mud? Mud doesn't produce plants. The Gemara answers, bimasunta. We're not talking about mamish mud, we're talking about very moist earth, which is not subject to granulation because it's very moist. It's not mamish mud to the point where like you step in it and you get cakes of mud on your boot, but it's moist enough such that it does not granulate. It doesn't break up into particles, and as a result you can't do kisei hadam with it. And that in that scenario you can't apply hoel. But the Gemara is suggesting, at least at this point, that in achinami, if this was regular earth, you would not be violating one of the 8 because of the principle of hoel, which would obviate the problem of charesha on Yom Tov. So Eis ve Abaye. So Abaye now challenges Rabbi from another source. Here's another brisa. Hamavashel gid hanasha b'cholav b'Yom Tov. If a person cooks the sciatic nerve, which is obviously we know that that's the gid hanasha zaser, you cook it in milk, and you do that on Yontif, va'ochlo, and then you eat it, lo kechamesh, you get malchus 5 times here. Yeah. Again, a glutton for punishment. Lo ke mishum mavashel gid b'yom tov. So first of all, you get malchus because you're cooking on Yontif something that is not meant as food. And so therefore that's one isser, because the Torah only permits oichel nefesh. The Torah does not permit cooking a forbidden substance. So next, number 2, veloka mishum oichel gid. The next one, number 2, is you're eating a gid anasha. Number 3, veloka mishum mevashel basar b'chalav. The third one is you're cooking milk and meat together. Now, there's a whole machloikis whether a gid anasha qualifies as basar or not, because one opinion is that it's flavorless and therefore it doesn't qualify as basar. But there's another opinion that says that it does qualify as basar, and therefore this price is going according to that latter opinion. Veloka, so that's, how many are we up to? 4. Veloka mishum, no, that's 3. Veloka mishum oichel basar b'chalav. Then you get malchus for eating basar b'chalav. That's 4. And then finally, veloka mishum havara, and you get malchus for creating the fire for cooking. So now the iyamrina, and you're doing an act of burning. In other words, you're burning substance in order to cook. Now, according to you, Rabbi, who holds of hoel, making a fire on Yontif, even if you're cooking a forbidden substance, should not be prohibited because of hoel. That in theory you could use this fire for permitted things, for cooking, so therefore there should be no isser of creating a fire on Yontif, even if your purpose in making the fire is to cook a prohibited substance. So Amarlei apik havara va'il gid hanasha shel nevela. So Rabbi says, you know what? My version of the brisa is different. You have to remove that 5th lav. The 5th lav is not making a fire on Yontif. The 5th lav is that we're talking about a gid hanasha that comes from a nevela animal, an animal that wasn't slaughtered properly. So therefore, that's the 5th mitzvah lo saseh. Frek the Gemara, but that's not going to work because Rabbi Chia has a version. Rabbi Chia taught in the brisa an elaboration on our first brisa. He taught as follows: Vatni Rabbi Chia lo kinshtaim al achilasa v'shalosh al bishulo. That out of the 5 enumerated, 2 of them you get malchus for eating, and 3 of them you get malchus for the cooking preparation. The Isa, but according to your version, Rabbi, where one of the 5 is eating a gid hanasha of nevela and not making the fire, shalosh al achilasumi boile, then it turns out that there's 3 of the 5 that you're getting punished because of eating. One is eating gid hanasha, one is eating basar b'chalav, and one is eating nevela. So ela apik havara va'ayil atse muktzah. Rather, says Rabbi, you're right. So it's not that the problem here is that you're eating a gidanosha of nevela, but rather you're using wood. The fuel that you're using to make the fire is from muktzah. It's from wood that was not prepared from before Yantif. And that's the fifth mitzvah lo saseh that you're in violation of. So, frek the Gemara, the obvious question, muktzah the oraisahu? Since when is the law of muktzah a Torah law? We've always worked under the assumption that muktzah is only midirabanan. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi says, Amrle in. So Rabbi is consistent with his shita. Rabbi in Maseches BAYT is where this major sugya is. Rabbi holds that muktzah is a din deoraisa. Dichsiv, v'haya bayom hashishi ve'ichinu eis asher yaviu. The Torah, in discussing the man, says that on Friday the Jewish people have an obligation to prepare anything that they're going to be using on Shabbos. So Rabbi learns from that pasuk that there's a mitzvah aseh not to have muktzah. Everything has to be prepared from before Shabbos. And muktzah, by definition, is that which is unprepared on chol for Shabbos. So therefore, he learns that it's a din d'oraisa, but that still doesn't give us a malchus. That doesn't give us a mitzvah lo saseh. Where do you get the mitzvah lo saseh? The azharasa mehacha. So the mitzvah lo saseh comes from here. Milo sasa kol malacha. You see, Rabbi says that the words lo sasa kol malacha, do not do any work on Shabbos, is a generic blanket statement that covers any forbidden act on Shabbos. So even though the formulation of the Isser of Muktzah was done in a mitzvah aseh, but this generic blanket statement of do not do any work on Shabbos converts any prohibition on Shabbos into a mitzvah lo saseh. And therefore you're going to get malchus for utilizing Muktzah on Shabbos. And that's the fifth lav, according to Rabbi. So Amrlei, so the Abayah says to Rabbi, but wait a minute. Atu de Amart, ba'i minei me Rav Chisda, v'amrila ba'i minei me Rav Huna. You yourself, Rabbi, once told us that you asked Rav Chisda, and some say that you asked Rav Huna, Hevi se me efer ushechato tamid biyom tov mahu. The question that was asked was, if a person brings a sheep from the wilderness on Yontif, so this sheep is muktzah because it was not set aside, it was not prepared from before, and you shecht it as a korban tamid for the korban tamid on Yontif, what is the halacha? In other words, have I committed a mitzvah lo saseh by having done this act of taking this animal? Am I allowed to bring this animal, like Rashi says, mahuli karev? Can I bring this animal as my korban tamid, as the communal korban tamid? Be'at amartlan, and you said to us, you Rabbi had answered to us that your position was that Allah, the amartlan Allah, you told us that seh velo. I'm just looking at the girsa here. What's the change in girsa? All right. Anyway, that seh velo habechor, that you cited from a pasuk in Yecheskel. Now the pasuk in Yecheskel is from the Navi, admittedly. But you based your psak based upon the verbiage upon a pasuk from Yecheskel. We'll leave it at that. The pasuk says, "V'seh achas min hatzon min hamasayim mimashke Yisrael." The pasuk states as follows: that if there shall be one sheep from the flock, and if there shall be 1/200th of wine for libation, that shall be used lemincha ulaola v'lishlamim, and shall be used for these various karbanos lechaper aleihem, to atone for the Jewish people. Ne'um Hashem Elokim, so says the Lord God. So what you explained from that pasuk is seh v'lo habechor, that you're only allowed to use this animal as a seh for a korban tamid, but you cannot use it as a korban bechor, meaning you cannot bring a korban bechor like this on Yontif. You cannot bring, and the reason we learn it out from the word seh, because the word seh implies either male or female, and a bechor can only be male. And the word achas in the pasuk indicates velo ma'aser, that you cannot bring a korban of meiser behema on Yontif, because the word achas means that even if the animal is not part of a larger group of animals, then it can be brought as a korban, to the exclusion of meiser behema, which can only be brought when you're tithing this animal from a group of other animals, because you take every 10th animal from the herd and you bring it as a korban, so that excludes meiser behema korbanos on Yontif, and min hatzon, and furthermore the words min hatzon in the pasuk implies velo hapalgas, that you cannot bring an animal that's an in-between age animal as a carbon on Yontif. It either has to be within a year old, in which case it's called a keves, or it has to be clearly 2 years old, in which case it's called an ayil. But if it's only 13 months old, which is at the very beginning of its second year, that's not kosher to be brought as a carbon, because doesn't fit the right age. And min hamasayim mimosar shteimeyo shenishtayiru babor. And when the latter part of the pasuk, which talks about wine, a beverage being brought as libation on the mizbeach, it says you can bring 1/200th from that which is left in the vat of the wine press. And what we learn from there is mikan lo'orla shebetela b'masayim, that you learn from here that if there's a forbidden beverage which within the wine vat, that forbidden beverage is bottle in 1 and 200. We use this to apply the halacha that orla, which is a forbidden kind of wine beverage because it's harvested from grapes that have not yet, where the vines are less than 3 years old, that if orla wine gets mixed in the vat, it's bottle in 1 and 200. That's also what we derive or base on our halacha based on this pasuk. And mi mashke Yisrael, and the words mashke Yisrael, from the beverages of Israel, what does that teach me? Min hamuter li Yisrael. It has to be permitted to a Jew. The beverage that is going to be poured on is a libation on the mizbeach. Mikan amru. And from here the rabbis taught us that you may not bring untithed wine product on the mizbeach. It has to be permitted for Jewish consumption. So yachol lo yavi min hamuktzah. But now let's continue. You might think that an animal that is brought in from the wilderness and therefore is muktzah cannot be used as a korban tamid. Amart matevel miyuchad she'isur gufo garam lo, avkol she'isur gufo garam lo, yatsa muktzah she'in isur gufo garam lo, ela isur davar acher garam lo. And you taught us, Rabbi, that no, you are allowed to bring an animal that comes from muktzah. You can bring that as a korban tamid, a communal korban sibor, even though it's muktzah. Why is that? Because the only thing that you see is prohibited is something that's tevel, something that has an intrinsic isser because it lacks tithing. Its isser is intrinsic to the substance itself. But if the isser on a substance is extrinsic to it, which means it's something that comes from some other source, in this case, the reason why this animal is usher is not because intrinsically there's some problem with the animal, but rather because it's yontif. That's what we would call an extrinsic isser that's attached to this animal. So therefore that's not similar to tevel, and therefore that animal is permitted. Now that's what you taught us, Rabbi, based upon this pasuk in Yechezkel. But it seems like the pasuk in Yechezkel is not a legitimate source text, but rather, Rabbi, you were teaching us rabbinic law based on the pasuk in Yechezkel. My question to you is, if you're telling me that the isser of muktzah is an isser dioraisa, v'yamart isser muktzah dioraisa, mali isser gufa, mali isser davar acher, then what difference should it make whether muktzah is an extrinsic or intrinsic isser? That seems to be only a conceptual difference that can apply to rabbinic prohibitions. But if something is asr min haTorah, then what right do you have to use it as a korban? And va'od, and my next question is, ha'atu de'amart chiluk melachos l'Shabbos ve'ein chiluk melachos liyom tov. I have another question, Rabba. If you're going to tell me that in this brisa, having to do with cooking the gid hanosha on Yontif, 2 out of the 5 involve a violation of Yontif, you taught us that even though it's possible to get 2 separate infractions for violating on Shabbos, you can't get 2 separate infractions when you violate Yontif in one act. Meaning that if I do cooking and I do burning to prepare my gid hanosha, I should still only be liable for 1 isser, for 1 la, for 1 set of malchus. And so that in general is difficult for you, Rabbi. How can you tell me that 2 out of the 5 malkios that I'm going to be getting for cooking this gid hanosha, both 2 out of the 5 involve a violation of Yontif? If for multiple violations of Yontif involved in one act, I only get malchus once. And so it can't be that I'm getting malchus twice for the same isser of Yontif. So ela apik havara va'ayil atze ashera. So the Gemara says, you're right, says Rabba, it can't be that we're dealing with muktzah here. That can't be one of the 5. for all of the aforementioned reasons. But rather, the fifth one, says Rabbah, is not muktzah, but rather you're using wood from an asherah tree to bake the fire, and so therefore you're utilizing avodah zarah and ve'azhara mehacha. And how do you know that that's a mitzvah lo saseh? Because the Torah says v'lo yidbak biyadcha me'uma min hachera. Because the Torah says that your hand may not cling at all to that which is forbidden spoils from the idolaters when you go to war with them. If you're dealing with using asherah sticks, wood from an asherah tree, then there should be an additional malchus, because the Torah also says you may not bring an abomination into your home. So ela'apik havara va'ayel atze hektish. So Yudmar says you're right. We can't be dealing with an asherah tree violation, because then instead of getting malchus once, you get malchus twice, and that would mess up the math. And instead of there being 5, there'd have to be 6. So the Gemara says you're right. We're dealing with atze hektish. You're taking sticks that were sanctified for the temple, and you're using that to cook your gidanasha and yantif. That's the iser. The azhara mehacha. And how do you know that using hektish sticks involves a mitzvah lo saseh? Because it says va'asherehem tisrafun ba'esh lo sasun chein lashem elokeichem, that the Torah says that you have to burn the asherah trees of idolatry, but you may not burn that which belongs to hektish, that which is lashem elokeichem, that which is for your God. And that's the fifth mitzvah lo saseh, says Rabbah. You get malchus for burning something which belongs to hektish. And with this we'll conclude. You have a wonderful day and a good chodesh.
But they wouldn't find